You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. Joining me on the podcast today is Robert Poole of the Reason Foundation. Bob, welcome to Economics Detective Radio.
Thanks very much, Garrett.
So, Bob is the author of a new book. It's called Rethinking America's Highways, a 21st Century Vision for Better Infrastructure, which we'll be talking about today. He also recently wrote an article for Reason called Stop Trying to Get Workers Out of Their Cars, which caused a bit of controversy. It's a provocative piece, so we'll be discussing that as well. So, Bob, how about you start by summarizing what was your thesis in that Reason article?
Well, the thesis in that article is that the reason we have large urban areas is what are called urban agglomeration effects, that lots of positive sum transactions can happen between individuals and also between individuals and employers. And there's some good research from NYU in the last couple of years that says what we really need to do to maximize a region's economic productivity is to make it easy for those connections to be made in the form of employment relationships. And that means we should have faster commutes over longer distances and have policies directed toward doing that, because you maximize the space available for a firm to be able to recruit employees. And from the employee standpoint, potential employee, you maximize the number of job opportunities that are going to be a good fit. The problem with a lot of smart growth policies, particularly the ones that try to produce jobs, housing balance, and that create live-work neighborhoods, is that this ignores those urban agglomeration effects. You might get a job, but it's not going to be the most productive job either for you, the company, or the region's economy. And so I identified this as we have policies working at cross purposes. In the name of somehow solving transportation or environmental problems, we have policies that will work hard to make the regional economy less and less economically productive.
Yeah, so I mean, those agglomeration effects are clearly real. Otherwise, we'd all be evenly spaced over the face of the globe and not tightly packed into a few large cities, as we tend to be. But yeah, so I mean, I found myself agreeing with some of your arguments in the article, and then others not so much. So, you mentioned that the smart growth proponents have tried to make urban growth boundaries and road diets, which are taking away traffic lanes to make wider sidewalks and bike lanes. But you also mentioned upzoning, which would seem to be very much beneficial from an agglomeration perspective, because you can, if you upzone, you can have more housing and more business in the same space because you build up. So isn't upzoning
that's a good point.
A positive in your view then?
I think it can be. I mean, there are some cases that I'm familiar with of upzoning that was imposed on existing residential areas that seriously constrained the property owner's ability to do what they wanted with their property. And so I think you have to look carefully at the overall impacts of a policy like that. But I think you make a good point that you can create opportunities for people to live in proximity to some sources of employment by upzoning where it would not have been possible with lower density zoning. So yeah, there's pros and cons there, and I wouldn't issue a blanket condemnation of it by any means. Right.
So you're critical of transit or of policies that try to focus on transit over driving. Do you want to elaborate on just what your objection to expanding transit is?
Right. I mean, the transit works best in cities that have the traditional central business district form, and I think of New York, London, Paris, where a large fraction of all the jobs are in a central core, and a radial set of transportation corridors, probably best done by heavy rail, is an appropriate configuration of transit for that and can be pretty effective. The problem is that in the United States, at least, which is most of my actual data, the vast majority of urban areas are not like that, and the trend, even in the large metro areas like Chicago and New York and Washington, D.C. and elsewhere that have traditional cores, those cores are getting over time less of the region's overall job bed. And in fact, in the United States over the last 40 years, the commuting patterns have switched to be predominantly from suburb to suburb, as we've had the massive suburbanization of jobs in this country, the decentralization. And so it's almost impossible to meet a very significant fraction of the commuting trip needs with a rail system that's in any way affordable when you have such a dispersed pattern of living and working. The best you can do is a grid type bus system that is going to always involve transfers, and that's better than no transit. But most of the heavy emphasis by planners and by the federal government has been on fostering and helping to pay for new rail transit in metro areas where it just does not have a very large role to play. And there's empirical data done at several Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. and the University of Minnesota have both done large-scale studies looking at what fraction of jobs can be reached in a metro area, in the largest 50 metro areas in the United States, by transit within an hour, one way. And it's very small percentages in most metro areas. Whereas by car, you can reach in 30 minutes virtually every job in most metro areas, despite the fact that we have traffic congestion in most of those areas. So there's a much smaller role for transit being realistic in most U.S. Urban areas than is consistent with what's actual policies are trying to accomplish.
Okay, so to sort of summarize, transit works really well when there are a lot of places going from a lot of people going to the exact same place and
right.
Coming from the exact same places. But if you have everyone coming from and going to a different place, then what they need is some form of transportation that is individualized, like a car.
Exactly. And that kind of in the future, that may be some significant fraction, may be some kind of mobility as a service with some degree of shared riding. But it's going to be much more flexible and decentralized than rail transit for the vast majority of commuting trips in the large majority of American metro areas.
Right. So it's sort of I guess a coordination problem almost. Like there's a type of city where rail and transit works really, really well, but in most American cities have not been built that way. So just adding transit wouldn't make sense. If you could, radically change the shape of cities to have that central business district and surrounded by radial suburbs there where people commute in, then transit would make sense. But that's a really large change, and you can't have one without the other.
Yes, it's a change that seems very unlikely, unrealistic in the world that we actually live in.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, some cities do follow that model more or less. And for instance, a lot of big companies are moving their headquarters to Chicago, and part of that is to be, in an urban center with a lot of transit to the center, so that your workers can live within a fairly short commute and live in a sort of walkable, nice area. What do you think of that trend? It seems like there's a market demand for these sorts of cities.
Well, that trend is going on. I don't know. I have no data really on the magnitude of it, And we know from the decennial censuses in the United States going back to as early as 1960 that the trend of predominant commuting patterns becoming more and more suburb to suburb is still happening. And so I agree that I mean I read the Wall Street Journal and other news sources and see that there are some of the kind of moves you talked about, General Electric, Boeing, and some others. But it's hard to see at this point that this is a trend that has any chance of overturning the large predominant trend of suburbanization of jobs.
Right. So let's talk about your broader work. As I mentioned at the start, you wrote a book about rethinking America's highways. What would you say is the biggest, or what are some of the biggest problems with the way the American highway system works now?
Right. Well, first of all, let's look at the symptoms. We have chronic problems that there's very little progress in addressing. One is chronic congestion during peak periods on the freeways. We have large problems of deferred maintenance of highway systems state by state, although some states are worse than others. But it's a problem that exists everywhere. There are lots of identified major projects in the highway system that could help make things work better, but it's very hard to come up with the funding for them. And so they sit there on drawing boards, and most of them don't get built for a long time. We have problems of quite a few projects being built for political rather than economic reasons, and the value of the output is less than the cost of the inputs. And so we're wasting resources when transportation investment money is scarce. And it seems really bad to spend on low value projects when there are high value projects that would really add benefits. And the fundamental funding mechanism in the United States is state fuel taxes per gallon and federal fuel taxes per gallon. And those when they were first introduced for the federal level for the Interstate Highway Program in 1956, they were very popular because people could see that they were a user fee. They would get something directly to benefit them from paying that tax. But over time, over 50, 60 years since then, those taxes and a lot of state fuel taxes have morphed into much more generalized funding sources for anything and everything that has some connection to transportation. And so now they are seen as just another tax by a large fraction of the voting population. And so it's the federal fuel taxes in the United States have not been increased since 1993, and only about half the states in the last 20 years have managed to get voter permission to increase their state gas taxes. So this is a funding system that's already in trouble, and because we know that propulsion mechanisms are changing, electric cars and other non-petroleum fuel sources, fuel tax is now starting on a decline in terms of the actual annual revenue that we can expect in coming decades. And so we have a problem, a fundamental problem of the funding mechanism being on a road to becoming quite inadequate for the needs. So those are the symptoms that need to be addressed. And there's obviously piece by piece, there should be solutions. For example, we should use pricing to deal with traffic congestion. We need a better way of procuring highway projects because deferred maintenance results partly from the lowest bidder, the lowest cost of initial construction gets the job in most cases. And that means the roads aren't built in a durable way that would last longer. But also annual transportation budgets adopted by legislators. Maintenance is not the sexy thing. Cutting ribbons on new projects in members' districts is the sexy thing. And so basically, I mean, it's a little bit of an overdrawn caricature, but maintenance gets the leftovers in annual highway budgets. State DOT may be a very responsible agency, but it only can spend what the legislature decides, and the legislature tells them what to spend it on. So we have a system that is not geared toward producing a well-maintained highway system. There's very little use of long-term financing. Almost all of the projects, apart from toll roads, are done on a cash basis, and you can't build a $2 billion project out of this year's cash flow in most cases, and that means the $2 billion projects seldom get built. And as I said, we have political motivations for deciding what projects get built. Legislatures meet, and that's the problem. And then we need to replace the per gallon fuel tax with some kind of per mile charging, but that is so it was a long uphill battle to try to convince the public that this is necessary and that it will not be a big brother riding along in their car reporting back on everywhere they go. So
Right.
those give the outlines of what I draw from that is that we have the wrong institutions, a dysfunctional set of institutions between the funding, the politicization, and it occurred to me about 30 years ago, I edited a book on utility monopoly. And I learned a lot about public utilities. And it turns out that if we think about highways as a kind of network utility analogous to, let's say, electricity, water supply, telecommunications, and so forth, the highway system doesn't really match those characteristics. In all of those utilities, customers pay the provider directly. They don't pay a tax to the legislature that then funds the provider. Even if it's a municipal government utility, you pay the utility and you pay based on a bill that says this is what you used of this kind of service, and therefore that's what you pay. And it occurred to me just some years ago that is really a better model. The government is still involved and would still be involved, but wouldn't be so politicized if we had highway providers that had a direct relationship with their customers, that the customers paid them, and the providers felt like they were accountable to their customers rather than accountable to politicians. And so that's the basic thesis of the book, is that we need a different set of institutions for highways, and we need over time to transform them into something more like real utilities that work quite well in the United States and probably do in Canada as well.
Yeah. We I'm here in Vancouver, BC, and the government recently went in the opposite direction. We had a toll bridge. People commuting into the city from across this bridge had to pay a small fee each time, and it raised a lot of money. People still used it. It was self-supporting, and they removed that toll. Now now the maintenance for that bridge has to be paid out of general revenues, and it does seem like it makes a lot of sense to have that pricing, because it gives so much immediate, so much feedback as to what part of the infrastructure is being used heavily and, is in high demand, and what parts are not.
Exactly. I mean, this is the same mechanism that works in electricity and in the other utilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it you had mentioned that funds are not allocated well towards these highway projects, and sometimes a lower priority, lower value project wins out over a higher value one. Do you have any more thoughts about why that happens? Why do people build highways that aren't going to get used or aren't as high value as some other project?
Right. Well, this seems to be what appeals to politicians in a legislature to do. They love the idea of cutting ribbons in their district. And of course, in the state legislature in the United States, there may be as many as several hundred legislators in at least the lower house, each of whom has a district who would like to every year go back and say, this is what I brought to you to improve your highways, or roads, or whatever. And that means that there's a political imperative to try to get as close to that situation as they can. And there may not be in districts A, B, and C projects whose benefits are greater than their costs. But hardly any state DOT even presents proposed projects to the legislature with a valid benefit cost ratio calculation to show them that it's really a sound investment. So there's really no control over that political horse trading that contributes to a large amount of the decision making that actually goes on as to what projects are going to be done. If you imagine trying to run a cell phone operation on that kind of a basis, you would get cell towers where the politicians wanted them, as opposed to where they were needed best for the most seamless and high quality service. I mean, this is a system that is just not very well tuned to doing the job well.
Yeah, I'm reminded of a study that I can't recall the exact study, but it was about the New Deal and how the vast majority of infrastructure projects and spending undertaken during the New Deal went to swing states rather than particularly hard hit states. And it makes sense that, if you're a politician and there are certain districts that you need to win in order to get reelected, you're going to do what you can for those districts, and that's because that's your incentive.
Absolutely, and you can see this. We see this in the United States in the federal government when there are discretionary programs. This is done by the administrative branch, the executive branch of government, as well as legislative branch. For example, during the Obama administration, there was the Tiger Grants program, and disinterested analysts looked at the allocation of which projects in which states and districts got selected, and they tended to be heavily in states where Democrats were in power. We just have now the Trump administration, and they have a new an infra program, INFRA, discretionary grants, and the majority of the money and projects went to districts that had supported Trump in the presidential election. So it's not just a problem of legislatures; it's a problem of executive branch.
Yeah, that's I mean, you vote for someone and they win and then they come and bring back goodies. It's not an ideal system for building a transportation network.
No, it's not, and that's been. I think most of us have not really appreciated how different that politicized system is from all the other utilities that we depend on. I mean, and this is not a question of privatization per se. We have in traditional utilities in the United States, at least, and probably true in Canada, we have three different models. We have investor-owned companies that have a long-term franchise but they're not there forever. We have government utilities, which are owned and operated by the government, and we have rural utility co-ops. And there are thousands of those in the United States, telephone co-ops and electric co-ops, that the governing boards are made up of customers. So we have three models that all of them, though, operate in the same way, that there's a direct customer-provider relationship. The utility sends out bills based on what you used and how much you used, and you pay the provider directly. This is true. The city I live in has a government water department. So we get a water bill every month, and we pay it to the city that goes directly into the water system's account. We have an investor-owned electric utility, and I pay the bill to that every month, and it goes directly to the utility. But it's the same model, whether it's run by the government, by a co-op, or by an investor-owned company.
I think that one reason maybe highways are not built on this model is because in the old days, you had to literally bring your car to a stop at a toll booth to pay a toll. That's no longer true, but we sort of have the legacy of that with many highways, with the funding model not using tolls for the most part, although now it can just be a camera that snaps a picture of your license plate and sends you a bill, which doesn't slow you down or inconvenience you in any way.
Yes, I think that you're right. Both that the legacy of the cash toll payment is a negative for the direct user pay model, but the evolution in recent years of fully automatic, all electronic tolling at highway speeds really is a game changer, and that I think is going to make it more possible to even have the switch from per gallon to per mile charging. because it's painless and doesn't cause the long waits, the accidents at toll plazas, the emissions from cars sitting there and stop and go waiting to go through, and all those sorts of problems. It changes the game, and it's a lot less costly than the old cash toll collection.
Yeah. I had an interview on this show with Chuck Marone of Strong Towns, and one thing he emphasized was something that you also mentioned, which is that the funding structure for these highways really prioritizes building new ones over maintaining existing ones. And so the way I believe it works for the most part is, you can get a federal or a state grant to build a new highway or a new piece of infrastructure, but then the maintenance is usually taken on by the local government at just your municipality, or the local government. It's generally funded through property taxes, but often in these lower density areas there just isn't enough revenue to maintain what's already been built, uh and yet often they just keep building more.
And also the revenue that's available is in contention
Hmm.
for all kinds of functions. And so highways do not always rise to the higher level of priority that we might think they should have. But it's understandable that when the money has to be spread over education and healthcare and every other thing under the sun, the highways don't always come out looking well funded.
Yeah, so politicians tend to treat highways.
Well, let me
Oh yeah, go on.
give you some evidence that when we have a different model, things really are better. I've spent a lot of time studying state and local toll agencies in the United States. So these are government toll road companies, basically, and they operate like municipal utilities. Basically, they charge their customers. You pay the bill based on what you use. But when it comes to maintenance, because their projects are long-term finance by issuing toll revenue bonds based on the toll revenue, the bond holders have quite a bit of say-so about how these things are managed. And in fact, most of the financing for toll roads involve what are called bond covenants that toll road agency or company agrees as a condition of getting the money, selling the bonds, that they will maintain a maintenance account that actually, in many cases, has first call on the toll revenues before the debt service payments to the bondholders. Now, why would the bondholders do that? The reason they would is because they know that if the toll road is not properly maintained, people will go elsewhere, and then the toll revenues will not be collected because the customers are gone. So they recognize that proper maintenance is critically important to the viability of the toll road. And there's no such mechanism in our public sector state highways. Again, it's all determined by the legislature and the political imperatives there. We see that same behavior in the small but growing movement in the United States to have long-term public-private partnerships develop and operate and maintain additions to the highway system. For example, in the Washington, D.C. metro area on the beltway around the District of Columbia in Northern Virginia, there's now express toll lanes that are under a 75-year long-term toll concession, financed, developed, built, operated, and maintained by the selected company. In this case, is Transurban from Australia. And they have exactly the same kind of bond covenants for their revenue bonds as state toll agencies have, like the Pennsylvania Turnpike Authority, in theirs. And so that mechanism works. It's a way of building in responsibility for good stewardship, if you will, that is simply absent in the public sector for the most part, despite good intentions on the part of state DOTs that are actually responsible for the roads, but they don't own them and they don't have control over their budgets.
Right. So it definitely seems like, from the perspective of building and maintaining the highways, having a user fee model makes a lot of sense. But let's sort of shift to the perspective of the users themselves. if they have to pay for the highways and the roads and the bridges that they use, presumably that'll cause them to be more economical about where they drive and what whether they whether they are going to go across that bridge that has a significant toll. And can you talk a little bit about the incentive for the user? Would charging a toll
Yes,
reduce
yes.
congestion, do you think, or change behavior in other ways?
Well, we already have evidence that certainly that a variable toll will change behavior. There's about 40 projects now in operation in the United States that are called managed lanes or express toll lanes that have been added, usually added to freeways that have chronic congestion problems. In some cases, they are just converting carpool lanes to toll lanes. But in all of these cases, the variable tolls rise and fall. Most of them are dynamic. Every 5 or 10 minutes, the rate is changed based on the ongoing real-time traffic conditions. And so the idea is that as you raise the price, some people at the margin will say, no, that's too expensive. I'm going to invest in regular lane. And the idea is to regulate the traffic flow in the price lanes so that they will always move at some minimum level of average speed, like 45 miles per hour. And this is working. It's working. You can go out any of these large metro areas that have them in operation and see it working effectively. It also, it provides incentives for people that would like to have the benefits of the faster and more reliable trips to use an express bus service that are generally being expanded in places where there are these relatively uncongested lanes. I helped Florida Department of Transport. I live in Florida. Helped Florida DOT to analyze and go forward with a project to convert the carpool lanes on I-95 in Miami into express toll lanes. In the first 4 years they were in operation, the express bus ridership between Fort Lauderdale and Miami using those lanes quadrupled. And I don't think anybody has ever seen that fast an increase in bus ridership. But this was a vastly more beneficial service than had ever existed before. The carpool lanes were mostly clogged, just like the regular lanes, because there was no effective enforcement of the rule that there had to be at least two people in the cars. So the buses were called express buses, but they were poking along in stop and go traffic in the so-called carpool lanes. Now they ride fast and keep a reliable schedule, and it's just amazing the amount of increased ridership that we have seen. And similar kinds of things are going on in other metro areas, in the Virginia suburbs of Washington, D.C., and Dallas, and Fort Worth, and some others. So this is a very promising idea from the standpoint not just of the motorist who uses the price lanes. It also frees up to some extent some space in the regular lanes for people who don't want to pay every day. And most people don't pay every day. Most people use them only, choose to pay only for trips that are particularly time valuable to them, where being on time wherever they're going is worth more than the cost of the toll at that particular hour of that particular day. So this is turning out to be a winning proposition that really does show that incentives matter, and people will have incentives to somewhat modify their behavior even during commuting hours when you would think, well, they have to be at work, but they have choices and choose whether to spend more time or more money on the commute.
Yeah, yeah. It seems like there's a weird mix of car transportation having been greatly subsidized in some areas where maybe it shouldn't have, or maybe the optimal amount of driving is less, and then strangely restricted in other areas where maybe it's more valuable to have people driving around and going from where they are to where they need to be. There are so many knock-on effects of the way the highway system works. Like, 50 years ago, you could have 10 small towns, and each of them could have everything a person needs, and lots of small businesses and things like that. Now you'd have 10 small towns and a Walmart in, the most central one, and everybody drives to the Walmart and then everybody drives home. And it seems like that kind of, structuring towns that way sort of kills them and is really, really inefficient in terms of, just the investment in and the subsidization of highways and driving.
Well, certainly, if people were directly paying for all major, at least major highway uses, they would see it's right now. What you pay for roads is hidden. Everybody knows what they pay for cable, what they pay for cell phones, what they pay for water and electricity. People have no idea. I'm serious. I've tested this many times, and people don't have a clue. They often think that the per gallon tax that's charged, gas tax, is actually a sales tax, and that if the price of gas goes up, it means that the amount they're paying in gas taxes goes up, which is false. It's only based on how many gallons they use. But I did some numbers in the book, and I think the average person in a household only pays about $40 a month in federal and state gas taxes, which is smaller than almost any of their other utility bills based on national average figures. But they don't even know that. They think they're paying a lot more than they really are. And so transparency in what people pay for highways, what I think would have some value in letting them see just what it is that's out there. And they would think there's a lot of pilot projects going on right now in the United States, federally funded, test mileage-based user fees. And what we're learning, people when they actually have a little meter in their car that says if there were a pricing system, this is what you might be paying. And this has been done in Melbourne, Australia, also in a very large program. People tend to think about making trips by car. I mean, some of them, of course, they'll have to make, feel like there's no choice. But others, they will think twice and decide, well, maybe I can combine several purposes in this trip and not make 3 separate trips to do those things. All of a sudden it becomes visible that they're costing them something to do this.
Yeah, yeah. And those kind of policies, well, I guess there's sort of a tension between having a fee that you want to create an incentive by making people think about whether they're going to drive and incur this fee, and the fact that governments really like to make their taxes as non-visible as possible because taxes are not popular.
Yes. No, that's exactly right. I mean, so this is a perverse consequences of the way governments tend to work. But I think the transition is not going to be easy. I think it's a transition we're going to have to make, particularly if electric cars become as popular as some people project, and this devastates the gas tax revenues. We're going to have to figure out how to persuade people that this transition is necessary and will actually be better. They will see what they're paying for. If they're unsatisfied, if they're dissatisfied, and say, well, why don't we have a bridge there? Or why aren't there more lanes on this road that we're always stuck in traffic on? They say, well, okay, the highway providers would say, we do our numbers. This is what's going to have to go. The rate is going to have to go up by a half a cent per mile and stay there in order to pay for building and maintaining that addition. And people would, well, okay, now we know. Do we want this or not? It would be a different world from the opaqueness that is now there that lets people agitate to prevent or roll back gas tax increases. Just today, I got an email that in California, where a big, like a 15-cent gas tax increase was approved by the legislature last year, there's now a ballot measure has qualified for the November ballot to repeal the entire thing. And this is seen as a great victory for taxpayers, quote unquote. But it would devastate road funding, which is way underfunded in California.
So, before this interview, I put out, I asked some Facebook groups about if they wanted me to ask any particular questions to you. one person wanted to know about your proposal for mini tolled underpasses. First, do you want to explain
Oh,
what
yeah.
exactly those are and how they work?
Sure, yes. We call it giving, let's say, typically a 6-lane arterial, which are sometimes called boulevards, are the major surface streets in metro areas, giving them a treatment that allows people to basically bypass the traffic signals. In some parts of the country, including Florida, where I live, the total cycle time of a red light, including left turn only lanes and things like left turn only light arrows and so forth, is 3 minutes. So if you hit a red light, you're going to be stuck sitting there doing nothing for 3 minutes. And if you hit several of them on a long, 5 mile journey or on an arterial, you're going to sit there, waste a lot of time. So the idea is to put underpasses, overpasses where the land uses permit, but more likely underpasses because they're less visually obtrusive, that charge an electronic toll of maybe 35 cents as an option. That you'd still have lanes, at least 2 lanes going to the traffic light plus a left turn lane if you want to do that. But if you have it, just like the express toll lanes on freeways, if you really want to get somewhere faster and more reliably, you could opt for the set of tolled underpasses and have a much faster trip. And we've done some preliminary. Nobody's built one of these with a toll charge on it. The first one that I know of was opened a few months ago in, of all places, Malaysia, by someone who I've met via email. But we think that in on arterials that have already a lot of congestion, putting in a series of the underpasses would probably, the cost of building them would probably be largely, like 70% covered by the likely toll revenue. And so this makes them certainly worth a try. And here in the Fort Lauderdale area, near where I live, the state DOT is proposing something very close to that on a corridor that's only about 2 miles, but has 4 signalized intersections in it. It connects 2 freeways, and was always originally intended to be a freeway itself, but protesters prevented that from happening about 25 years ago, and it's become a huge congestion bottleneck. So they're proposing to have, instead of just underpasses, they're making the whole 2 point something miles a depressed lane that would go under the cross streets and would still allow on either side of the express lanes, the regular traffic lanes that could access the neighborhoods on either side of this corridor through the traffic signals. So this might actually, it's now in the design stage and might actually get built in the next few years. It would be the first of its kind in the United States.
Okay, those seem really interesting, and I can think of several places here in Vancouver that where thousands of people have dramatically slower commutes because they have to stop at every single light during rush hour, and having some kind of way to alleviate that would be really, really great. But how does this mini tolled underpass work for pedestrians? If I live, a block away from one, and I want to walk to the other side, is there a way for me as a pedestrian to get across, or do crosswalks need to be elsewhere?
Well, there would still be the signalized intersection with walk lights,
Mm,
presumably. So that would be the preferred way. I mean, one could build sidewalks with guardrails inside, but I think it would be not a very pleasant place to be
hmm.
wandering under, and I would not recommend that as the best solution to the problem. I think opting for the signalized intersection, and you wouldn't have to wait. You don't have to wait 3 whole minutes. You wouldn't likely for a walk light, at least in the peak direction. So that's probably the less bad. One we thought about when we came up with the idea of putting a bus station at the bottom of the underpass. But people that we showed the idea to said, well, that's not going to be very attractive probably for bus passengers because it will seem noisy and dark and so forth. So our preferred design has the bus stops either just before or just after the downgrade, and you still want to be able to provide connections for buses at perpendicular arterials.
Okay, so yeah, it seems like you have everything. You still have the option to drive exactly and walk and everything exactly the way you do now, waiting at the light and all that. It's just in addition, you can skip the light, pay a small amount. Or do you have some idea what level of toll would have to be paid at these places?
Yeah, the numbers that we've used are again like on the express toll lanes. We for simplicity we assumed 35 or 40 cents per underpass during the busiest peak hours. A shoulder rate that would be like 30 cents, and a nights and weekend rate of maybe 20 or 25 cents. And the numbers that we calculated on the revenue took a pricing scheme like that into account. But that's the important point that you just mentioned is correct, that this is an option that would be available to cars and to buses. So, for example, instead of necessarily having to take away a lane for express bus service on an arterial, if you had this underpass treatment, and the buses go free, then a long distance express bus could go several miles without having to stop and would be faster and more reliable, just as buses that operate on the express toll lanes on expressways. So this is again like those. This would be a motor personal vehicle solution, but also a express bus solution.
Yeah, yeah, and it would please, I think, both the people who like to drive and the people who like to have transit to just make everything smoother on some of these major roads that also kind of serve a dual purpose of.
Right. These are multimodal corridors in that sense, and we try in the work that we do here at Reason Foundation and that I do in the book and so forth to really look at all the users, not just the cars, and making the bus system faster and more efficient and more customer friendly is doable. But we haven't given this enough attention, I think, we as a transportation community haven't given enough attention to that because there's been, I think, more attention than warranted on bringing light rail to communities where it can only make tiny difference in the actual amount of transportation service provided, but at a very high cost.
So we're running up on the end of our time. Do you have any closing thoughts? Any sort of main takeaways that you want listeners to come away with after hearing this interview?
Sure. Well, I think the main point I want to try to get across with the book in particular is that we need to rethink the institutional structure of how we provide highways. And this is probably mostly applicable to Canada as well as the United States. A politicized structure for what is basically a network utility is very far from the best answer. I mean, we see that we don't have the same kind of massive battles over funding, over what gets built where in the other utilities. I mean, I guess I said, if you try to run a cell phone system like we do highways, we would probably still be back in the monopoly, the Bell system monopoly era with black phones and so forth. The wave of the future for a much better and more better balanced highway system, and one that's transparent about what it costs and what you pay for, is going to be to convert it into something like a real utility model with pricing, with a direct customer provider relationship, with long-term financing, and with built-in incentives and requirements for proper ongoing maintenance so that you have stewardship of the assets that otherwise will wear out prematurely and cost a lot more overall over time than if they were properly cared for in the first place.
And with that, my guest today has been Robert Poole. His book is Rethinking America's Highways, which we'll link to at the show notes page at economicsdetective.com. Bob, thanks for being part of Economics Detective Radio.
I'm very glad to do this, Garrett. Thank you so much.
The discussion question for today is, what are some of the biggest problems in the transportation network in the area where you live? Are there major bottlenecks that you think could be dealt with potentially through some of the changes that we discussed in this episode? Do you think the transportation in your city works particularly well? Are you in one of those cities with a central business district where having light rail makes a lot of sense? And if so, does your city have a transit network that you particularly like and you think works well? Let me know in the discussion in the Economics Detective Facebook group. That's a closed group. You can request to be let into it, and you just need to answer a few questions just for my knowledge. I'm not denying anyone entry to the group on the basis of their answers, so don't worry about that. Come join the Economics Detective group on Facebook.